through love and leaving, birth and grieving, the cold realities of war and the vivid warmth of homecoming. Life's simple events and emotions, comings and goings, leaving yet always returning down the road that leads to the place we call home. Hi Matt, the award-winning series starts on Saturday at 10:10 on 2.
In 2 minutes on BBC One, you can see highlights of Wimbledon 88 Match of the Day and the European Football Championship semi-final between West Germany and Holland. And here on 2, in 50 minutes, we look back on the final day's play in the second test at Lord's. Now it's time for Newsnight.
The Toronto summit ends with help for the world's poorest and most indebted countries. But are some of the debt mountains too high to overcome? Good evening. The leaders of 7 of the world's richest countries end their summit in Canada, promising more help for the poorest peoples on Earth. The Toronto communiqué, issued 2 hours ago, agrees to measures that will lead to the cancellation of some of the debts accumulated by the drought and famine-stricken nations of sub-Saharan Africa and the rescheduling of other debts. We'll be reporting from Toronto on the outcome of the summit and getting Mrs. Thatcher's verdict on what has been achieved. And I'll be asking the former Chancellor of the Exchequer, Denis Healey, and the Chief Economic Advisor to Lloyds Bank, Christopher Johnson, whether this summit has been generous enough to the world's developing countries. In Luxembourg, the European Court rules that VAT must be extended in Britain. Among those hit, the construction industry, charities, private health and private schools. I'll be talking to John Biffen, former Cabinet Minister and leading common market sceptic, about today's decision. The BBC will now be allowed to broadcast all its radio programmes about the security services in the series My Country Right or Wrong. And why so much of Britain's defence equipment keeps breaking down. An all-party committee at Westminster condemns the Ministry of Defence and says the civil servants can't even keep tabs on the scale of the problem. First, the economic summit, and for the 7 leaders gathered in Toronto, tonight marked the end of an era. President Reagan has had his last hurrah on that particular stage and has no doubt enjoyed the plaudits of his fellow summiteers in Toronto.
Rooney says you are admired and respected and will be missed. How do you answer that?
Thanks.
The next annual meeting of the so-called G7 leaders will be attended by President Dukakis or President Bush, and it'll be one of them who has to deal with the shouted questions from the White House press corps. Mr. Reagan's final summit, unlike many of its predecessors, did not come at a time of foreign policy crisis. So this time the leaders chose to spend most of their time on social and economic affairs. The communiqué issued tonight may not set the pulses racing with its standard placebos about the world economy, the need for optimism to be restrained by caution, and so on. Nevertheless, the summit did focus on one somewhat non-Reaganite concern: the debts owed by the world's poorest countries to the world's richest countries. We'll be looking at what has been decided in just a moment, but first, Martin Bell reports from Toronto on the summit's final day.
They had wanted a unity summit and they got it. They had wanted an upbeat summit. They got that too. It was a graceful farewell for Mr. Reagan on his 8th and last such occasion, as the presidential motorcade slid through the city to the final show of togetherness. This is part of the ritual of economic summits when the leaders gather for the reading of their communiqué. The British called it a constructive and important document, though it ran a mighty length with few surprises. It was also a sort of a State of the Nations report.
Since we last met, our economies have kept up with the momentum of growth. Employment has continued to expand generally, inflation has been restrained, and progress has been made towards the correction of major external imbalances. These encouraging developments are cause for optimism, but not for complacency.
Most of the leaders then walked through the media village next to the conference centre to deliver their own accounts of the 2-day summit. In Mrs. Thatcher's case, a positive review.
So the very clear message which goes out from Toronto
is one of confidence coupled with a commitment to build on and reinforce our success.
A short while ago, she was interviewed by James Long.
Prime Minister, what do you see as the main achievement of this summit?
I think first that we've agreed to consolidate the policies which in fact have led to an unprecedented level of success and standard of living that we have now. Those will continue, and we've agreed to tackle the things which are really outstanding and must be tackled next. First, there's a tendency for some countries to go to protecting their own companies, which would reduce trade. We want more trade, not less, and so we must stop protectionism. We'll try to do that. We've started to tackle the problem of agriculture, where you know we're producing more food than can be eaten. We started that in Europe, and we should have to continue that during the coming year, and we've got a commitment to do that rather beyond the coming year for quite a number of years. And thirdly, we really realize that some of the poorest countries, particularly those in Africa, have got themselves landed with so much debt. They can't repay it, they just can't get out of their problems. So we say that provided you'll agree a new program and a new way to go about things with the IMF, we in fact will write off your debt so you'll not have to repay it. And if you've got trade debts, we'll give you longer to pay and cut the interest. So that should be a very real help to them and give them a new start. And you know, if it's a help to them, in the end it helps the whole world.
Now, Britain's been pressing hard for that for 18 months. There's been suggestions that America's been dragging its feet. It's reluctant to go perhaps quite as far as the other countries. Is that the case?
Well, I think it will probably go in a slightly different way because it has different policies with Congress. But what we've all done is agree to share the burden pretty fairly, and though we might not all do the same thing, we'll all agree to take our share in forgiving the debt or in rescheduling it.
Now, President Reagan's last summit, what does the future look like to you? And do you think that you're going to occupy a slightly different role as senior statesman of the summits?
Well, as a matter of fact, I've been here longer than President Reagan. I can remember when he came. So I don't have very much different role in the future from the one I've had. It's been marvelous to work with him. And he was absolutely terrific this summit. Absolutely terrific, in on every single debate with proposals for the future. And it really has been a remarkable cycle of summits. We've all together achieved far more in this 7-year cycle than ever in the first 7-year cycle. And its policies very similar to those which President Reagan and myself have been firmly advocating that are now accepted as the right policies for the future. So it has been a historic time, and we have a lot to thank him for on the defense field. And it was marvelous that everyone thanked him, both privately and in front of the press.
But will it change your role in future summits?
I don't think it'll change my role. I will carry on exactly the same way as I have. There are certain things I believe passionately. We put those into practice. They're working. They're giving higher prosperity, better standards of living, distributing capital much, much more widely, enlarging opportunity. We still have to tackle the problems, what I called in one debate, the real human nature behavioral problems, the drug trafficking, the crime, the terrorism. Those, in a way, are much, much more difficult than industrial change, much more fundamental.
The Prime Minister talking to James Long in Toronto tonight. Well, the fact that this summit would deal with the problem of third world debt was well advertised, but it wasn't known how much relief would be given or which of the indebted countries would qualify. In the event, it seems, there's been something of a division into the deserving poor and the rather less deserving. The countries that stand to benefit are mostly those of sub-Saharan Africa. Those that won't are in Latin America. Will Hutton has been looking at today's debt package and how it was actually arrived at by the G7 leaders.
Ever since third world countries threatened to default on their loans 6 years ago, the debt crisis has become the 1980s version of the boy who cried wolf. Warnings of impending calamity, but as yet to be realized, at least in the industrialized West. The poor countries of the world owe over $1,000 billion to the richer, and half that debt is concentrated in the hands of just 17 countries, mainly in Latin America, while the even poorer countries of sub-Saharan Africa are in debt to the tune of some $40 billion. A smaller amount, but for both groups the effect is similar. Economies that are buckling under the strain.
It means using your export earnings to repay debt instead of using the money to buy new capital equipment and to buy food for people. And imports have gone down for a number of the indebted developing countries. Imports are a smaller amount per head, which means that not only a sacrifice of luxury goods, but sacrifice of essential goods, capital equipment, but also sacrifice of purchases of food, and it means an increase of malnutrition.
It was Nigel Lawson who made the first attempt at debt relief, a plan for sub-Saharan Africa that had survived 14 months of sceptical international scrutiny and was still on the table in Toronto. Governments who'd lent money should cut interest rates and write off some of the debt, he argued, a refrain taken up recently by the French, who would write off as much as a third of all the loans they'd made. In the event, American objections have scaled back Anglo-French ambitions.
There are very important differences between the credited nations, and this has led to the need to adopt a minimalist position, a sort of minimum common denominator. For example, the US was opposed to debt relief to Africa for this last year, and therefore nothing was done. Finally now the US has come round to accept the kind of position that Nigel Lawson and the French have been pushing, but they are willing to make smaller concessions than the Europeans.
The rich creditor countries are to choose how they will help. No Lawson or Mitterrand plans. There'll be tight relief limits, only applying to countries who have excessive debt burdens. And finally, only the poorest will benefit, those with average incomes below $425 a head. The total estimated bill, less than $500 million.
I think that the alleviation is a first step in the right direction. It may only affect those countries who are so-called debt distressed and therefore whose whole economy is strangulated by lack of foreign exchange. But I think it is a very welcome step because it will relieve situations of extreme poverty. But obviously there are also a number of countries which for some reason may not statistically fall in that category, who may also need further help.
Yet for all its limitations, the Toronto debt package is something of a watershed. The first concrete recognition by the industrialized countries that the problem can drift no further. And after the sub-Sahara, why not Latin America? In fact, just the very precedent the Americans have been so anxious to avoid. The Japanese had resolved on their own first economic summit initiative, a plan to ease the debt burden not just in Africa, but globally. It offered debtor countries an easy-to-pay debt scheme under IMF surveillance, but the Americans objected. Their approach is to let each country negotiate its own salvation. No plans, no organised relief, no taxpayer-funded bailouts.
I think the Japanese authorities will be very disappointed indeed. It represents quite a significant move on the part of the Japanese authorities to become more centre stage in international economic developments. The proposals towards third world debt were very important. It's an issue that does need addressing, and given US lack of enthusiasm on this issue, I think the Japanese authorities will be very disappointed indeed.
It's important to remember that there's a difference between Japan, who's a major surplus country, and the United States, who is a deficit country, and itself the largest debtor in the world. So the United States cannot, for structural reasons, make major concessions on debt, or indeed is not willing to make major new loans, whereas Japan has the financial ability to do so, and also has a much more long-term objective, is looking for dynamic markets in the third world with which to trade and in which to invest.
Economic summits tend to be written off as non-events, but Toronto is another incremental step in the evolving constitution of world economic management. A recent preoccupation has been currencies, now it's debt. And if the Japanese didn't get their way this time round, there's always next. The world is changing, as are its leaders.
With me now to discuss some of the issues explored there by Will Hutton are Christopher Johnson, who is the Chief Economic Advisor to Lloyds Bank, and also the former Chancellor of the Exchequer, Dennis Healy. Mr. Healy, you've been one of those throughout the 80s who's been warning about the problems of third world debt. How encouraged are you tonight that the G7 leaders seem to be becoming more interventionist in the matter?
Well, it's better than nothing, but it falls far short of even Nigel Lawson's ideas. And it's all still in principle. We don't know precisely who will get what or even what countries are involved. What is clear is that this new plan will affect only about 8% of the total third world debt. The Latin American countries, whose debt is the most dangerous to the world economy, are not affected at all. And I think what's particularly disturbing is that there was no attempt to find an answer to the general problem, such as the Japanese, for the first time, did propose they wanted to write down the value of the debts to the same extent that they have already been written down by the banks. I think that if you look at Latin America, you've had the total amount of debt double practically since 1982. Almost the whole of the borrowing they've had has been to pay off earlier debts. Only 8% has gone into new investment, and the standard of life of those countries has fallen 9%. Their imports from the United States have fallen very, very heavily, and the debt squads are producing revolutionaries throughout the continent. And I think unless something is done very soon about Latin America, the world will revolt against the idea of the poorest countries exporting capital to the richest, and incidentally, the biggest debtor in the world, the United States, not even mentioned at the summit, although it's getting all its debts paid by other rich countries on no conditions at all, unlike the poor countries who are having draconic conditions imposed on them which rule out growth. So I think the problem has barely been recognized at this summit meeting, but I think your correspondent is right in suggesting that the thing is beginning to turn, and I think the next American president, whether it's Mr. Bush or Mr. Dukakis, is likely to take a very much more positive view than President Reagan, who has been positively antediluvian in his approach to this problem for the whole of the last 8 years.
Christopher Johnson, we'll come on to the African countries in a moment, but because Dennis Healy has concentrated so tellingly on the Latin American problem, do you agree with him that this is still a very dangerous one for the Western world as a whole?
Yes, it is, but some of these Latin American countries have improved their debt situation enormously. Mexico, for example, which has now got its inflation rate down to less than 2% per month. Last year it was running a balance of payments surplus. It's got oil, which may become more valuable in future. It doesn't, in fact, need the kind of distress relief which the African countries and some of the poorer Latin American countries like Bolivia or Haiti might qualify for. Now, Argentina is a very different case. Argentina is facing the biggest deficit in Latin America. It relies on agricultural exports. It has a weak, although democratic, government. And one can't say that the treatment for Mexico and Argentina should be the same.
In other words, are you saying that the Toronto summit ought to have been more refined and targeted, so to speak, in its approach by putting some of the South American countries in with the sub-Saharan ones?
Well, no, I'm really saying that the Latin American debt is a matter for the commercial banks, because they have been the biggest lenders. Now, in Africa, it's the governments who are the biggest lenders. Most of these countries don't qualify to borrow a lot of money from the banks. So I think rightly the governments were dealing with both the most distressed area and the one in which they were responsible for most of the debt incurred through export credits and soft loans.
And the South American situation, you say, should be left to the commercial system?
Yes, well, of course, the authorities in each country, the central banks are following this very closely. But it's not the kind of thing which I think was appropriate for the G7 leaders to try to settle at a summit.
But I disagree,
yes.
I'm afraid, with that. I think that leaving it to the commercial banks requires the commercial banks to go on lending to Latin America so that they can continue to service their debts, and they're getting fed up with it. They're suffering from what's called debt fatigue. And I heard only this weekend, talking to a leading American banker, that the chief executive officers now of the major American banks would like to write the debt off if they could do it. They weren't in many cases the individuals who incurred who made these loans, and they complicate an already very difficult and fragile situation to the American banking system. The World Bank and the International Monetary Fund and the Inter-American Bank are all very anxious to help in writing off these Latin American debts, and I think we shall have to come to that, because if there's a rise in American interest rates, and if there's a drought this summer, as seems possible there could well be, and an increase in American inflation, then I think you could find some of the Latin American countries, the big ones, saying, well, to hell with it, we're going to default, and that would wreck the whole of the international financial system.
We want to have a word about sub-Saharan Africa as well, because we heard the Prime Minister saying, when she was talking to James Long, that debts, as far as some of these sub-Saharan countries were concerned, were going to be written off altogether. Presumably you agree with that?
I strongly do. When I was Chancellor, I did write off the debt that we had in those days, this was 10 years ago, of the poorest countries south of the Sahara altogether. But unfortunately, they haven't yet agreed to do that. Some part of the debt may be written off, according to the communique. Some part may be given lower interest rates. As far as the Americans are concerned, they'll have the same interest rate but a longer time to pay.
Mrs. Thatcher seemed to be making a distinction between debts and trade debts, which I didn't quite follow.
No, nor did I, and I don't think she fully understood it.
If I could just come in on that point. The trade debts are export credits which we've made to these countries to help them buy our exports. And there we're talking about a reduction in the interest rate, not about cancelling the debt. Maybe we shall stretch out the repayment period, but the interest is to be related to the country's ability to pay and its export earnings. The debts to be written off, I think, are in a different category. They're soft loans over long periods at very low rates of interest.
But what it comes down to, Christopher, surely, is that the generosity is much less than it seems, because to the extent that the countries are getting this relief, it's because we know they can't pay the money anyway.
Yes, but I think the degree of generosity varies a great deal between one G7 member and another. And the Americans, in offering only to stretch out the repayment terms, are in fact being less generous than the British and the French and the Canadians. And I think it's a pity the G7 couldn't get their act together. They've really ended up agreeing to differ. They'll all do something, but it'll be something different.
But don't you think it was a mistake not to deal with the American debt problem, because it's that produced the stock exchange crash last October? It could produce another crash later in the year, even before the American election.
I'd like, if
and it wasn't even mentioned in the communique.
I'd like, if I may, to talk to you very quickly and finally about the fact that in this communique we heard Mrs. Thatcher saying that it was still important to have these countries, no matter how poor, that certain standards of economic performance and conduct should be expected from them before these extra concessions were extended. Do you agree with that?
Yes, I think it's important that these countries should have some kind of IMF policy program, but the IMF is now softening its conditions. In one or two cases like Zambia, it had inappropriately austere programs which the countries rejected, even though they were just as deserving as many others.
Well, I think this is true. I think on the whole the IMF has been forced by the Americans to be far too rigid in the conditions it's applied, and we need also to treat these problems essentially as problems of development rather than debt. The United States developed in the 19th century by borrowing from Europe and defaulted in many cases on its loans, and we've got to accept that the poorest countries in the world will not be able to develop without help from the richer countries.